Part 1. The Forgotten Prison. Deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains lies the forgotten town of Coldwater, a place shrouded in mystery, where time seems to have stopped. The town, once bustling with miners and their families, is now little more than a ghost town, its buildings crumbling and overgrown with weeds. But there's one structure that dominates the landscape, casting a long, dark shadow over Coldwater. Coldwater Penitentiary. The prison, built in the early 1900s, was intended to house the most dangerous criminals in the region. Its towering stone walls and iron gates were designed to keep the worst of society locked away from the world. But over time, the prison became something more, a place of unspeakable horror, where the inmates weren't the only ones trapped within its walls. For decades, Coldwater Penitentiary operated in relative obscurity, its grim reputation growing as stories of brutality, torture, and unexplained death spread. The warden, a man named Ezekiel Blackwood, was a figure of fear and respect, known for his strict discipline and merciless enforcement of the prison's rules. But there were whispers, rumors that the warden was more than just a man, that he had made a pact with something dark, something evil, to gain power over the inmates. In 1952, without warning, the prison was abruptly shut down. The official reason was a budgetary shortfall, but the locals knew better. They spoke of a riot, a night of bloodshed that ended with the warden and several inmates dead, their bodies never recovered. The prison was sealed, its doors locked, and its history buried. The town, already in decline, soon followed, as if the closure of the prison had drained the life from Coldwater itself. For years, Coldwater Penitentiary sat abandoned, its stone walls slowly crumbling. Under the weight of time, nature began to reclaim the land, and the forest crept ever closer to the prison's gates. The townspeople, those few who remained, avoided the place at all costs, warning travelers to do the same. But the prison's dark allure was irresistible to some, particularly those with a fascination for the paranormal. And so it was that, in the autumn of 2023, a group of urban explorers decided to investigate the old prison. Among them was Alex, a seasoned explorer with a penchant for the macabre, and his friends, Emma, Jake, and Lily. They had heard the stories, of course, the tales of ghosts, of strange lights seen flickering in the windows at night, of disembodied voices and the feeling of being watched. But they were drawn to the prison all the same, eager to see if there was any truth to the legends. The night they chose for their expedition was a cold one, with a full moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The group set out from their base camp just after midnight, armed with flashlights, cameras, and recording equipment. The forest was silent as they made their way through the underbrush, the only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. When they finally reached the prison, they paused to take in the sight. Coldwater Penitentiary was as imposing as they had imagined, its stone walls rising high above them, the iron gates rusted and covered in ivy. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and a chill seemed to emanate from the building itself. As they approached the gates, Alex felt a sudden sense of unease, a prickle of fear at the back of his neck, but he pushed it aside, determined to see the exploration through. The gates creaked loudly as they pushed them open, the sound echoing through the still night. Inside, the courtyard was overgrown with weeds, the stone path barely visible beneath the tangle of roots and vines. The prison loomed above them, its windows dark and empty, like the hollow eyes of a skull. They hesitated for a moment, the weight of the place pressing down on them, before Alex took the lead, guiding them towards the main entrance. The door was heavy, made of thick wood reinforced with iron, but it swung open easily, as if inviting them in. Inside, the air was cold and stale, thick with dust and the smell of damp stone. Their flashlights illuminated the long, narrow corridor that stretched out before them, lined with doors leading to various rooms and offices. The walls were stained with grime, and the floor was littered with debris, papers, broken furniture, and the occasional rat scurrying away into the darkness. They moved cautiously through the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of paper seemed magnified in the stillness, and they found themselves whispering to each other, as if afraid to disturb whatever might be lurking in the shadows. As they passed by the warden's office, they paused, the door slightly ajar. Inside, the room was eerily intact, as if frozen in time. The warden's desk, a massive oak structure, sat in the center, covered in a thick layer of dust. Papers were scattered across its surface, along with an old rotary phone, and a tarnished brass nameplate that read, "Warden Ezekiel Blackwood." Behind the desk, a large portrait of the warden hung on the wall, his stern face gazing out at them with cold, lifeless eyes. Something about the room felt wrong, as if they were intruding on a place they had no right to be. The air was heavy with an oppressive energy, and the temperature seemed to drop the longer they stayed. Emma, feeling a sudden wave of anxiety, suggested they move on, and the others quickly agreed. They left the office, closing the door behind them, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Part 2. Descent into Madness. As they ventured deeper into the prison, the sense of unease grew. The corridors seemed to twist and turn, leading them in circles, and more than once they found themselves back where they had started. The building was a labyrinth, designed to confuse and disorient, and it wasn't long before they began to feel its effects. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord, flickering at the edges of their vision. In the cell blocks, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The rows of cells were dark and foreboding, their iron bars rusted and broken. The doors hung open, creaking in the wind, and the walls were stained with years of grime and mold. The smell of rot and decay was overwhelming, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the corridors. They split up to cover more ground, agreeing to meet back in the central courtyard in an hour. Alex and Emma took the north wing, while Jake and Lily headed south. The silence was deafening as they explored the cells, their flashlights casting long shadows on the walls. Every so often, they would hear a noise, a faint whisper, a distant clank of metal, but when they turned to investigate, there was nothing there. In the north wing, Alex and Emma found themselves in the isolation block, a place where the most dangerous inmates were kept. The cells here were smaller, windowless, with thick iron doors that sealed off all light and sound. The air was stifling, and the walls seemed to close in on them as they moved through the corridor. At the end of the hall, they came across a door unlike the others. It was larger, made of reinforced steel, and adorned with strange symbols that neither of them recognized. The door was slightly ajar, and from within, they could hear a faint rhythmic sound, a low, chanting murmur that sent a shiver down their spines. Against their better judgment, they pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was pitch black, the air thick with the scent of burning incense, and something else, something metallic and pungent. As they fumbled for their flashlights, the chanting grew louder, filling the room with a sense of dread. When they finally managed to switch on their lights, what they saw made their blood run cold. The room was a makeshift shrine, the walls covered in strange, arcane symbols drawn in what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room stood an altar, draped in a tattered black cloth, upon which sat a grotesque statue, a twisted figure with the body of a man and the head of a goat. its eyes glowing with a malevolent red light. The chanting seemed to emanate from the statue itself, a deep, resonant voice that spoke of darkness and death. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The chanting grew louder, the voice echoing off the walls, and the temperature dropped sharply. Alex and Emma were paralyzed with fear, unable to move as the air around them grew thick with an oppressive energy. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the symbols glowing faintly in the darkness. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the chanting stopped. The room was plunged into silence, the oppressive energy dissipating as quickly as it had appeared. The door swung open, and they stumbled out, gasping for air. They fled the north wing. The image of the grotesque statue burned into their minds, the feeling of being watched more intense than ever. Meanwhile, in the south wing, Jake and Lily had found their own horrors. They had stumbled upon the execution chamber, a small, sterile room with a single electric chair bolted to the floor. The chair was old and rusted, the leather straps cracked and worn with age. The air in the room was heavy with the smell of ozone, and the walls were lined with glass windows that looked out into a small viewing area. The room had an unnatural stillness, as if time itself had stopped. The lights flickered as they entered, and the temperature dropped sharply. As they approached the chair, they could feel a cold breeze blowing through the room, even though there were no windows or vents. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and they could hear faint whispers, as if the room itself was alive. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging them into darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and they could feel something moving in the shadows. The temperature dropped even further, and the air became thick with the smell of burning flesh. They fumbled for their flashlights, their hands shaking, but when they finally managed to turn them on, they wished they hadn't. The execution chamber was no longer empty. Standing around the chair were the ghostly figures of inmates, their faces twisted in pain and anger. Their bodies were translucent, their eyes hollow, and they stared at Jake and Lily with a malevolent intensity. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. Jake and Lily backed away, but the ghosts moved with them, their hollow eyes following their every move. The air grew colder, and they could feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on them, suffocating them with their presence. Just as they were about to turn and run, the ghost suddenly vanished, leaving the room as empty as it had been when they entered. But the feeling of being watched remained, an unseen presence lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. They fled the execution chamber. The image of the ghostly inmates burned into their minds, their hearts pounding in their chests. Part 3. The Truth Revealed. When the group finally reconvened in the central courtyard, they were all visibly shaken. The prison had taken its toll on them, its dark history weighing heavily on their minds. They shared their experiences, each story more terrifying than the last, and it became clear that something was very wrong with Coldwater Penitentiary. Determined to uncover the truth, they decided to make one final push to the lower levels of the prison, where the worst of the prison's secrets were rumored to be buried. As they descended the narrow, winding staircase, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in on them. The sense of unease grew with each step, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the darkness. The lower levels were even more decrepit than the rest of the prison. The walls were damp and covered in mold, and the floor was slick with water. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the only light came from their flickering flashlights. They moved cautiously through the maze of corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. At the end of a particularly long and dark corridor, they found a door unlike the others. It was made of heavy iron, reinforced with chains and padlocks. The door was covered in strange symbols, similar to those they had seen in the shrine, and the air around it was thick with an oppressive energy. It was clear that whatever lay behind the door was something the prison wanted to keep hidden. With a sense of dread, they began to remove the chains and padlocks, their hands shaking with fear. When they finally pushed the door open, they were met with a blast of cold air, the temperature dropping sharply as they stepped inside. The room beyond was vast, a cavernous space that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with strange artifacts, old books, rusted tools, and objects that defied description. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, upon which sat a large ornate chest, covered in the same symbols they had seen before. As they approached the altar, they could feel the air grow heavier, the oppressive energy intensifying. The chest seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and the room was filled with a low, rhythmic hum, like the beating of a heart. The sense of dread was overwhelming, but they were determined to see this through. With a deep breath, Alex reached out and opened the chest. Inside was a small black book, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was adorned with more of the strange symbols, and the air around it seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy. As Alex picked up the book, the room grew even colder, and the humming grew louder, filling the room with a deafening noise. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and the room was plunged into darkness. The air grew thick with the smell of burning flesh, and the walls began to pulse with a sickly, green light. The symbols on the walls seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like snakes, and the air was filled with the sound of chanting, the same deep, resonant voice they had heard before. The ground beneath them began to shake, and the air grew so thick with energy that it was difficult to breathe. The book in Alex's hands began to glow, and the symbols on the cover pulsed with a malevolent light. As the chanting grew louder, the room was suddenly filled with a blinding light, and they were thrown to the ground by a force they couldn't see. When the light finally faded, they found themselves back in the central courtyard, the prison silent and still. The book was gone, and the oppressive energy had disappeared, but the feeling of unease remained, and they knew that something had been awakened, something dark and terrible that had been lying dormant in the prison for decades. As they stumbled out of the prison, their minds reeling from the experience, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of the prison's dark history. The prison had taken something from them, a part of their souls that they would never get back. And as they left Coldwater Penitentiary behind, they knew that the darkness would follow them, haunting their dreams and whispering in their ears. But what they didn't know was that the prison wasn't done with them. The book they had found was no ordinary book. It was a key, a doorway to something far more sinister. And by opening it, they had unleashed a darkness that could not be contained. Part 4. The Final Twist. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. Each member of the group started experiencing terrifying visions, nightmares of the prison, of the warden, of the things they had seen in the lower levels. The visions were so vivid, so real, that they began to blur the line between dream and reality. Alex was the first to notice the changes. He began to see the symbols from the prison etched into his skin, glowing faintly in the darkness. No matter how hard he tried to wash them away, they remained, pulsing with a malevolent energy. He could hear the chanting in his ears, growing louder with each passing day, until it was all he could hear. Emma, too, was haunted by the prison. She would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the feeling of being watched. Her dreams were filled with the image of the warden, his cold, lifeless eyes staring into her soul. The darkness seemed to follow her everywhere she went, a constant, oppressive presence that she couldn't escape. Jake and Lily weren't spared either. They began to see the ghostly figures from the execution chamber in their waking hours, their hollow eyes staring at them from the shadows. The air around them grew colder, and they could feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on them, suffocating them with their presence. Desperate to find a way to stop the nightmares, they returned to Coldwater, seeking answers. But when they arrived, they found the town deserted, as if it had never existed. The forest had reclaimed the land, and the prison was gone, swallowed by the earth itself. It was as if the prison had never been there, as if it had been nothing more than a nightmare. But the darkness hadn't left them. It had followed them back to the real world, a curse that would never be lifted. They had opened a door that should have remained closed, and now they were paying the price. The darkness was inside them, growing stronger with each passing day, until it consumed them entirely. And so, they vanished one by one, leaving no trace behind. The town of Coldwater was forgotten, the prison's dark history buried once more. But the curse remained, waiting for the next unfortunate souls to stumble upon the truth, to open the door and unleash the darkness once again. For Coldwater Penitentiary was never truly abandoned. The warden's spirit still lingered, bound to the prison by a pact with the devil himself. And as long as the prison existed, so too would the darkness, a curse that could never be broken. In the end, they were all just pawns in the warden's game, their fate sealed the moment they stepped through the gates of Coldwater Penitentiary. The prison had claimed their souls, and now it waited for the next victims, its dark history growing with each passing year, its hunger for souls never sated. And as the final chapter of their story was written, one thing became clear. Coldwater Penitentiary was more than just a prison. It was a doorway to hell itself, a place where the lines between life and death, between reality and nightmare, were blurred beyond recognition. And once you entered, there was no escape, no salvation, only darkness, eternal and all-consuming.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story and want more chills in your life, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss a new horror tale. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.